Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. We are almost ready to start. I think we'll just uh, wait 1 or 2 minutes to let that waiting room clear out. But we should be ready to go shortly after the top of the hour. Um, nice to see some folks with their cameras on and familiar faces. Hi, Pat. Hi, Steve. um, and Well, this is like chewing gum and walking, looking in multiple places, but hopefully we'll get it. All right, just another quick minute. Josh, I might ask you if you don't mind just to keep tabs on the waiting room, and we will not keep people who are already in here waiting. So as I said, welcome everyone. My name is Eva Jackson, and I'm Managing Director with ICLEI Canada. We are so excited to be launching the Cost of Doing Nothing Toolbox for everyone. This has been a labor of love, a labor of sweat, a labor of more than on one occasion tears, but we're pretty excited to introduce you to the toolbox and as well really do a little bit of as much of a training as we could, knowing that folks haven't had a chance to go through it yet. So today's webinar is structured both kind of a typical webinar with speakers, and then my colleague Josh, after our case studies, will do a bit of more of a walkthrough and share who the toolbox is assigned for, is recommended for, and is targeting, and how it can be used. So we're really quite excited to be launching it today. Before I do that, I of course want to begin today's session acknowledging, doing a brief acknowledgement to honor the traditional settlers of the land. I do realize we are logging in from all portions of the country and all different parts. So I'll focus on where I am located, which is in Toronto, on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I'm very thankful and grateful for the land that I get to live, work, and play on, which incidentally today has seen our first snowfall, so has transformed into a different land than when we went to bed last night. I think this, to start off, this is an audience that we don't need to belabor this point too. We know that climate change is costing municipalities billions in direct and indirect financial costs. Direct, of course, in the repair and replacements of hard infrastructure after floods or other extreme events. And then, of course, increased operations and maintenance cost due to aging infrastructure and increased wear and tear on that infrastructure. But of course, there are the indirect costs, such as municipal service disruptions, supply chain disruptions, not to mention others that we'll speak a little bit more later. These costs are growing. 8 of the top 10 costliest natural disasters have occurred over the past decade. Most often, costing estimates focus on insured losses, but we know that uninsured losses are far greater. So there were, for example, $700 million in insured losses from Hurricane Fiona. However, as we've seen, those uninsured losses are often 4 to 5 times greater than that insured number. Of course, federal and provincial governments have often played the role of backstop. However, with disaster relief funds being harder to access, this places a massive financial burden on municipalities and, of course, homeowners and business owners. What we wanted to do, though, in this toolbox was to start redefining cost assessments. In our research process that we undertook to create the toolbox, we found that these social and ecological costs were not always considered, especially in economic analyses. Most especially the loss of ecosystem services. They were not included. It was often a look at hard and traditional gray infrastructure. We also found that the consideration of widening the knowledge systems to Indigenous and local knowledges within the process of assessment of the costs lacking, particularly when looking across national and subnational sources. However, we want to make sure that users of the toolbox and readers of the primer really understand that in order to weave together Indigenous, local, and Western knowledge systems, it is really critical that that work is built on a foundation of trust and relationship building, and not one of extraction, where Indigenous knowledge is selectively used for a specific aspect. Indigenous knowledge should not be considered simply as a data to be incorporated or plugged in to Western scientific frameworks. It is important to really and wholly understand that Indigenous knowledge is part of a complex and evolving Indigenous knowledge system, which is rooted in social and cultural systems and lived experience of generations of Indigenous peoples. And really, the process of weaving together those knowledge systems is just that. It's about the process of doing that and not the products coming out of that, which is a different view than we often take on data. We are interested in products and not necessarily the relationship building and the processes needed in order to weave those knowledge systems together. And so this was something which was really fundamental to us as we were constructing the toolbox. Data availability was obviously an element that is of fundamental importance when trying to undertake this work. National and subnational data is time sensitive and is changing constantly as new information becomes available. In the time that we were undertaking the research for the toolbox, there were various new resources constantly being produced that looked at the health costs, that looked at infrastructure costs. So it really is, the timeliness of it is very important. They also, that national and subnational data also really varies by source and depends on the focus, whether it focuses on economic losses, insured losses, damages more broadly. Although that costing data is key to understanding larger trends and scale, and really is a huge part of building the business case. Therefore, if that national piece is ever changing and time sensitive and focus dependent, we really determined that local data was critical, as it can support those national figures with on the ground, real-time reporting from your municipalities. Now, what we did also find was that municipalities often lack capacity and often guidance on what data to collect, how to present it, to build that local business case, and how to communicate it. And so that's just a little bit of the context of what brought us to determine that this resource or toolbox was important and could be used by municipalities. Just a little bit more before I hand off to our two case studies on the challenges. So the need to build that business case for adaptation, costing actions versus inaction on the issue. Typically, when we've seen these cost of inaction or costing climate change reports produced, they've been outsourced to consultants working in this space. And that is certainly a great option for those that have the financial means and resources to do so. However, there hasn't been guidance or support for those local governments who may wish to take this on internally. Accessing funds for adaptation is, of course, another challenge, there are many barriers to accessing those funds. It can be time-consuming, convoluted. Often it's unsuccessful after a period of producing the applications. But also there's an internal challenge to finding support and buy-in to take on the actions that may have been implemented, and to dedicating internal resources, both financial and staff, to implementing those actions. So in sort of all of this, that's how we found there's this growing need for municipalities to assess the cost of doing nothing locally, to build the capacity to understand the costs and be able to speak about them to those decision makers that may be within their organizations and other partners. And as is often the case, and we say this as ICLEI, municipalities have started to trailblaze that work. And we're pretty excited to have two of those municipalities with us. And we'll have two case studies, one by the City of Windsor and one by the City of Hamilton. And Windsor will go up first, my friend Karina. Working with the City of Windsor's kind of efforts in this area really demonstrated leadership and the benefit of developing a local costing report to support investment and build buy-in for adaptation. The City of Windsor recognized early that there was a need to assess the local costs of climate change, and the technical analysis that accompanied their climate adaptation plan identified costs across impact areas identified in their vulnerability and risk assessment. Each cost analysis was supported by the adaptation actions identified within their plan, and together the plan and the costing report were passed by council. And I can honestly say it was Karina's work in doing this technical analysis that gave us the idea that other municipalities would want to know and understand how to put this together. And that idea then evolved into this toolbox. So I'll stop sharing here and invite you, Karina, to share your screen with a very quick introduction. Many of you will know Karina. Karina Richters is with the City of Windsor and has been a key champion and leader on climate action, both mitigation and adaptation. So very excited to have you, Karina, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Hey, thank you, Eva. So yeah, I guess a little bit about a little bit of background of how we got here. I'm going to go through a couple of slides really quickly and get into some of the details. But to give you some context of where Windsor has come from, so we've had numerous climate impacts. We've had tornadoes, we've had floods, we've had extreme heat, we have constantly expanding vector-borne diseases. We have provincial highways buckling under the extreme heat, high lake levels. So here's just some of what the City of Windsor experienced since 2016. And here's the costs. So these were all unplanned expenses that the City of Windsor had to deal with and manage in light of climate impacts. So in 2018, when we were updating our 2012 climate change adaptation plan, we brought forward a new report to our city council asking for them to approve some new impacts. So we brought all of our risk scores and our vulnerability for 19 impacts, and we're saying, you know, we were changing from just extreme weather, extreme precipitation and extreme heat into much more broader community impacts. There was 19, and when we brought this forward, council was like, yes, we agree with those climate change impacts, but can you tell us and can you quantify the risks and the costs on these impacts when you bring the final plan back to council? So that started really the task of how do we do this? How are we going to convey this information clearly to council, and what data is out there? So that was the really big question that I had to start. So here's just a couple images of our adaptation plan. And this is basically the climate change impacts in Windsor. The technical analysis is our appendix to that plan that details everything we dug up for each of the impacts to justify why we needed to act. So I'm quickly going to go through these, just one example of how we presented this information to council and the data that we basically sought. And so the one that I'm picking, which was the most comprehensive because we had the most data for, was our impact number 2, which was an increase in extreme precipitation leading to basement flooding. And again, we've had major events pretty much every year where we've had neighborhoods flood due to extreme precipitation. So we had great data here. So just a high level of what's in here. You can see on the left, this is basically our risk assessment. This is all from the BARC process, the vulnerability rating that each department felt and what the community said to us. So it's all kind of documented here. And then we started trying to educate the council on what are the climate projections and what does that mean for our future risk state. So that's there. And then we started to delve into what data do we have. So we looked at, we have historical flooding calls, we have maps of where there's flooding, we know the costs associated with the 2016 and 17 storm. Sorry, it's not advancing. But we also know we've done some action. So how many basements have had flooding subsidy programs undertaken? And then we started looking at other city facilities. So in the floods, two of our libraries flooded and had to be closed down. So there's a social loss there. And then we started looking into delving into the community and realizing that 40% of all of our homes did not have insurance to recover from the storm. So again, there's an economic loss, but also a social loss there that we had to somehow identify and convey to council that, there's our cost of cleanup, but there's also a cost to each of our residents that are impacted by flooding. We undertook in a separate study, we're doing our sewer use master plan. So we had actually, in this case, we're able to model what our future risk maps were under our climate change storms or our normal storms. So we could use this as well. So this is where it really started getting into the costing that really speaks volumes. So we looked at in this table number 5, and I'm happy to send this all along to Eva to link to any follow-up emails. But we said, okay, a 1 in 5 year storm in our climate future is going to be a 1 in 3. Our current 1 in 100 year storm is going to be a 1 in 20 year storm. So how many homes are in these little risk buckets that have the possibility of flooding? And based on our historical information, understanding that about $40,000 was the cost to retrofit or recover on an average home, we could easily quantify what that means. So if, for example, if a 100-year storm hits the city of Windsor and hits the whole city, we're looking at a $3 billion cost, economic cost. So in this case, I didn't even delve deeper. We know there's, lost productivity. People are going home during storms or leaving work. If there's a possibility of flooding, there's anxiety, ongoing anxiety. These are all documented things that at the $3 billion mark, I figured we didn't need to delve deeper into it. We know what's happening. But this is just one of the examples of the type of data that we had available. And so we were really able to hone really into the numbers here and identify the risk. So a couple more. So here's just a blow up of those numbers. And like I said, this does not include the city infrastructure cost, social cost, productivity losses. And really quickly, we did the same thing for high water levels. Here's our modeling that shows where the damage could occur. And here's the cost under the different climate events based on the property types. And then we just didn't look at the hard infrastructure. We looked at recreational amenities. Again, this speaks to the social loss. And we looked at our historical patterns of, how many times do we have severe rain events that basically force the city to close recreational facilities. So we had the numbers. We knew how much money we were rebating to our user groups, and we can project out from there. And then, tying in with our community energy planning, there is a study that basically shows the different scenarios and how much more electricity we're going to need to cool our properties. So again, economic loss, but this also speaks to the extreme heat in the city, but also the economic, I guess, the increase in economic losses that people are going to feel, and tie this back into energy poverty as well. Understanding that many people are not going to be able to afford to air condition their homes in the future when they need it most. So these were just some really high level examples, but really, why was this important? I'm like, first off, it allows me to tell a story of the past, our present, and what our possible futures may be. Moving forward, I'm using each of those impact assessments to monitor and report to council. I'm going to update those every 2 years to say this is where we stand. Is there new data, is there new projections, and how is this changing? It really highlights the urgency to act on adaptation, because we're gonna, you pay now, you pay later, but this really shows how much we could be looking at. And I also try to tie the report back in to the need to mitigate. We can't lose track of that. And this is a really old report from the National Roundtable on the Environment, but you can see the change between a low climate scenario and a high climate scenario for our increase in costs. And then there's one thing I forgot to add to this was grant funding. We've been able to use this data that I accumulated to apply for DMAF applications and others as well. So it was a really useful time or effort, I guess, to support other future initiatives. Oops. And that's all I have. I can turn it over to Trevor.
Thank you, Karina. I just thought I'd open the floor just before Trevor, if there was any clarifying questions for Karina. We do have time for larger questions, big picture questions at the end, but just thought in case there was a burning question for Karina of clarification. So I'll just give it 1 second. All right, Trevor, it seems that you are good to go. I'll invite you to share your screen. As you do that, I want to invite, just introduce Trevor Imhoff from the City of Hamilton. We were lucky enough to work with Hamilton as they were producing their corporate and community climate adaptation plan. And this work was really part of that process. So we're really excited, Trevor, to hear you talk about that.
Great, thank you very much, Eva and Karina. So I'm Trevor Imhoff. I'm the Senior Project Manager, currently now in the Climate Change Office. This is a newly established office in the City of Hamilton, which is part of Hamilton's overall climate action strategy, which I'll talk about in a second. But happy to be here and really talk about the benefits that the cost of doing nothing in this report help the City of Hamilton to move forward and ultimately have council approve the overarching climate action strategy, as well as just to kind of dive into some of the challenges and next steps that were identified through this process. So as I mentioned, so what I am going to be focusing on in this talk is the climate change impact adaptation plan on the bottom. Hamilton's climate action strategy, the most recent one, was approved by City Council in August of 2022, so not too long ago. And there are two main pieces of work. The first one is the Recharge Hamilton, our community energy and emissions plan, which is Hamilton's low carbon scenario technical, establishing the pathway to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And then, of course, the climate change impact adaptation plan. And I just wanted to do a quick shout out to my colleagues and team members who we're currently not team members anymore, and I miss them greatly, but specifically Andrea McDowell, who really helped lead the way on the climate change impact adaptation plan. There's also Christine Newbull that also helped to lead the community energy and emissions plan. And of course, Shelley Rogers, our coordinator, who really helped to provide the greenhouse gas emissions quantification numbers and calculations for the consultant for the community energy and emissions plan. So Hamilton's climate impact adaptation plan, it was approved with a vision to be a national leader in climate adaptation. We want to create a healthy, equitable, vibrant, and sustainable community that responds to the needs of all. And some of the, or many of the actions in the adaptation plan really highlight the important equity, diversity, and inclusion lens that were put on the actions to make sure that we're helping to reduce that climate inequity or climate justice piece as we move forward for climate adaptation. Whoops, I'm going backwards there. Just a quick shout out to the ICLEI's BARC framework, because I think it provides that methodology in order to move forward on calculating the cost of doing nothing, and I'll explain further in the next slide. But currently Hamilton is in milestone 4, we're implementing now, And I really do look forward to some of the actions that the city and the community together can achieve in the near future to help to prepare and provide some additional resources to our community, especially to those populations that need it most. And I just wanted to highlight some of the key deliverables that I think really help to inform the cost of doing nothing methodology, and then the framework that we used in Hamilton was really that Science of Climate Change report and the vulnerability and risk assessment. So in terms of that key methodology, I think it's very important for any municipality to use either the BARC framework or a similar evidence-informed or methodical pathway in order to, one, understand what are the future projected climate scenarios through the BARC framework, using global national climate models, downscale to the local level. So you can get an estimate of, okay, what are we going to experience, or what are we most likely to experience in the future? From there, you conduct the vulnerability risk assessment, both a corporately and community risk assessment that was conducted in Hamilton that identified 13 priority risk areas. And me, as coming from a public health background, we identified 13, and arguably, I think the top three in my mind are extreme heat, flooding, of course, and food security. And food security was somewhat of a new or emerging risk through this most recent vulnerability and risk assessment. So from there, we understand what is the potential climate scenarios, identified the 13 climate risk 13 priority climate risks that are most likely to happen in Hamilton. And then what we worked with Josh and Eva and Ickley on is then linking those impacts that are most likely, that Hamilton is most likely to experience. And we look to then begin the data collection of those risks related to the standard, for example, infrastructure costs, the emergency preparedness response costs, etc. I will say we were quite significantly delayed over the past couple of years. My team was deployed for the COVID response, being in public health. So we kind of had we did have a very tight timeline to get all of this information before the last council meeting of August. And so this is part of the challenge, and the lessons learned is you really do need that time and the dedicated staff to collect this data. So we brainstormed with Ickley, and we pivoted on, okay, we don't really have the time or the resources to collect the local data. So let's link these climate risks to to literature and trusted resources on a national or provincial scale. And this was very helpful for myself to present this information to council in order to show them that yes, we don't have the local impacts, but this is based on what Hamilton is most likely to experience, and then link that to national and or provincial estimations of climate impacts. And what this showed through the council presentation is that it's clear that in terms of a one-to-one comparison of a business case analysis, the costs of doing nothing far outweigh the costs of not only reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but of the climate adaptation actions as well. And so I think this really helped to provide the rationale, the value proposition for council to make that informed and confident decision to approve the climate action strategy, as well as to move forward on establishing, for example, and contributing to a climate change reserve that we now have access to, hopefully a growing amount of money for actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as to adapt to climate change. So in Hamilton's climate adaptation plan, there are overall 4 theme areas, 11 objectives, and 27 adaptive actions. And the work that Hamilton did with ICLEI in terms of the cost of doing nothing not only helped to provide that business rationale, but helped to inform the actions in the adaptation plan. And so, for example, on theme 1, the built environment, there's an action there to really move forward on conducting more studies and reviews on specific infrastructure across Hamilton to better understand the forecasted vulnerabilities and risk to that specific infrastructure asset, both in terms of a gray and green infrastructure perspective. A really important one, I think, is resilient theme 2, people and health, and that's really moving towards better public health surveillance and data collection on the health impacts. And this can be done it's arguably done best at the provincial level, but in lack of a provincial wide surveillance approach, what sort of local data can we collect, or our public health experts and epidemiology staff people can collect to better understand the health impacts of climate change. There's also some actions related to understanding and creating more consistent and accurate metrics and monitoring programs related to the natural environment, as well as some actions moving forward towards improving food security. And then, of course, there's another action in Resilient Theme 4 around energy systems and working with our local utilities to create or conduct a vulnerability risk assessment for those assets. This is where we provided information to council on the incremental investments for the community energy and emissions plan. And so here we kind of showed them the big price tag of like, okay, this is what our consultant who's done this for many other municipalities are calculating is what the incremental capital investments are. And that's an estimate of $11.4 billion. And I think without the information being provided by ICLEI and the cost of doing nothing, that would have just stuck out like a sore thumb, as council members would have just honed in on that. Wow, that it's going to cost $11.4 million to transition to a net zero economy by 2050. We do provide a business rationale in the community energy and emissions plan that there are savings as well. So when you combine the savings of avoided carbon costs, the maintenance costs, the avoided energy costs from the transition to a net zero community by 2050, you combine that with the estimates of the cost of climate change, it makes the decision very clear that, as I mentioned before, the cost of inaction far outweigh the cost of action. And that was the overarching message that we presented to City Council in August, which I do think helped them to make an informed and confident decision to approve the climate action strategy. And I'm happy and proud to say that we did get a vote of 12-1 in that decision to pass the climate action strategy. So just some quick challenges. And I think, Ava, you did a great job of explaining the challenges that Hamilton faced and we continue to face too. It really is around the data availability and accuracy. And I've kind of matched the lessons learned with the challenges. And just because you have a lot of data does not mean that necessarily transfers to knowledge. So that's an important part, is really understanding database management and how to extract that data that is most applicable to the outcomes or to the things that you want to achieve. Uncertainty of data to collect. I think this is an ongoing challenge that we face, especially with the ever evolving and as Ava said, the ever increasing supply of information related to climate impacts. And so really understanding, and I think this will be a benefit not only to Hamilton, but to many other municipalities. This toolkit can help to start the methodology and what data and how do you go about collecting this data? I think as a municipality, depending on the databases software that you use, I think municipalities will need to go or use the toolkit as a starting point to better understand or to create that framework, but really having a clear and robust data collection methodology with dedicated staff is definitely something we see as a must in order to do this properly. And of course, we do need buy-in, especially from our senior leadership team members, that will then help to make those decisions to dedicate staffing. And of course, I would just recommend don't underestimate the time that it takes to collect all of this data, to properly analyze it. As Karina, I'm sure, can attest to all of the great work that she's been doing in Windsor. This is definitely an ongoing work that the City of Hamilton continues to work on. It's embedded in our climate adaptation plan. And I think as we move forward on better understanding the local impacts by using this toolkit, it will only help the business case, the rationale, the value proposition for further and accelerated investment into climate action. So I'll stop there and say thank you.
Trevor, perhaps before you stop sharing, there's been a request in the chat to show your slide 7 again, if you wouldn't mind.
Slide 7. So we'll start at the start. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That one?
There we go. Is that the right one? I think it is. Can Trevor share slide 7 again? Thanks. So what we can do is with Karina and your Trevor's approval, we could share a PDF of your slide decks to those registered for the presentation, in addition to the webinar recording, which will be on our website, if that's all right. Karina, just so you also had a question of clarification that came in through the chat. How did you determine future events? For example, current storm is 1 in 100 and future storm is 1 in 50, as you mentioned in your slide. I wonder whether it's what did you determine high and low climate change, or how did you determine high and low climate change?
So we, for our future storm events, the City of Windsor and the County of Essex, we actually undertook climate change modeling for our rainfall intensity, duration, and frequency curves. And through that modeling, we realized, or the analysis shows, that in most climate projections, we're looking at a 40% increase in precipitation to our 100-year storm event. So if you look into that impact number 2, you can actually see how I graphed it out and realize that our current 1 in 100-year storm will become our every 1 in 20 year in the future because of those increase in rainfall intensities. So that's the one. And in most cases, I believe, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure at the beginning, I basically said we are always going to use the high emission scenario because that's the world in which we live. And then in cases where there was white papers that said, here's the low and here's the high, then I would look at the spread. Yes.
Thanks so much, Karina. As I said, we will have time for a longer question and answer period with both Trevor and Karina, Josh and myself about the toolbox a little bit later. But we wanted to pick up on a bit of the thread that Trevor started around data and data availability, data collection. It was based on our experience. Data collection in so many spheres of municipal work seems to be one of the main challenges. With barriers including no processes or mechanisms in place to store and share data. And Trevor, you certainly brought that up. And then a lack of communication pathways or interdepartmental silos that prevent that communication from happening. So we're going to launch a bit of a poll now. And Josh, I'll ask you to help me technologically with launching that, which on a scale of 1 to 5, how difficult would it be to collect data locally for you if you were to use the toolbox, or if you were to try to undertake this effort without realizing necessarily what is exactly, with 1 being easy and 5 being very difficult. So that should be popped up on your screens. And once we see some of those numbers pop in, we will share those results.
Yeah, we have about 53 of 89. So just waiting on a few more.
Okay. All right. I think in the interest of time, we should
Yeah.
share that so we can move on.
Yeah, I pretty much stayed. I got to a certain level and then sort of started that bell curve started happening.
Great. I'm not seeing the results, but I'm wondering if others are. It could just be my
It might
status
be a
post. Oh, Kate says you are able to see them. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for your help. So hard for me to discuss the results in that they're not popping up on my screen. But Josh, if you're seeing them, I wonder if you could.
Yeah, I mean, right now it seems that like optimistically, it's great to see that 40%, which is the highest number, do see it as doable. So it's there's some barriers to overcome, and there are some established maybe mechanisms and communication pathways in place, but it is doable, which is great to hear. Next, there are 34% see it as difficult. So that is the definitely something that we found and we've seen through working with Trevor and speaking with Karina as well. And then there's a number of people, about 15%, 16% that have identified as unknown. So it's a new area to explore, which is very understandable. But yet you're here, so that's great. So we're taking the first step towards understanding the costs.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Josh, for the synopsis and also for everybody for participating. And with that, maybe, Josh, I will hand it over to you. Josh Podolsky is a climate change project coordinator with ICLEI Canada and was deeply involved in creating the toolbox. And he will do a walkthrough of the toolbox and use cases. So we're really excited to, Josh, have you do that for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you, Trevor and Karina. That was fantastic. So being inspired by Windsor and piloting this toolbox through Hamilton, we have developed this toolbox of resources really to help other municipalities build their own cost of doing nothing reports. The toolbox is made up of 4 key documents, 2 summary appendices, and we have also included the 2 case studies. The aim of the toolbox is, as we've already started to talk through, is really to help municipalities weigh the costs of action versus inaction. To support the adaptation planning process using data municipalities have access to now, as opposed to having to do necessarily all that modeling, which is great to have, but it's also something that can be done with data that is available right now. And ultimately to create the cost of doing nothing report that supports any call to action. And we'll talk about what those calls to action can look like later. It's also important to note at this time, as we get into it, that the toolbox was part of the Advancing Adaptation Project, which was made possible with funding through the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. The starting place for developing these resources was to first identify the key risks facing municipalities across Canada and define impact statements. These 8 selected national impact statements are the framework around which the cost of doing nothing template was designed. The selection of these impact statements was guided by local expertise and is really intended to be representative across a range of sectors, geography, scale, and climate hazard. We applied a longitudinal research methodology to determine the key climate variables, impacts, and costs across each of the different impact statements. And guidance within the primer, instructions, and template documents was informed by this research, our experience working with municipalities, and especially our work with our case study municipalities. The toolbox is designed to be used by municipal staff in communities that have already completed or are in the midst of completing a climate adaptation plan, as both Trevor and Karina spoke to. A development of a cost of doing nothing report is really meant to supplement the adaptation planning process by highlighting the value proposition for adaptation. This means to assess the cost of inaction does require you to have an understanding of your local climate data, impacts, and risks, as also mentioned by Trevor there. Now, as we saw with that poll and some of the conversation with Trevor and Karina, data collection can be challenging. And while it's not necessary to have pre-established mechanisms for data collection, it is helpful to have an understanding of certain baseline data. But that said, we have designed these resources to be flexible to varying local contexts. And to provide, we've also provided a ton of guidance on data collection and the use of climate narratives, as Trevor spoke to, so that you can still build a strong case for adaptation, even if local data collection is still underway. The first resource in the primer, in the toolbox is the primer. The primer really sets the foundation and overall context for assessing the cost of doing nothing at the municipal level. It defines what the costs look like at the local level, and it identifies the national impact statements used within the cost of doing nothing municipal template. The municipal template was designed to help remove barriers for municipalities as they develop their own cost of doing nothing reports. The template is a Word document that can be easily customized and includes pre-populated and editable content along with notes and recommendations. The template is based on the 8 impact statements mentioned earlier and includes content on climate hazards, risks, vulnerabilities, and costs. To support the use of this template, we've also created this handy instructions document. The goal of this resource is really to make sure you have everything in one place to effectively use the template. In a few moments, I'll be giving a walkthrough of the template and how to use it, so stay tuned for that. As municipalities begin to create their own cost assessments, we've also developed a tracking tool in an Excel spreadsheet format, which suggests potential sources of climate variables, costs, and impacts data, and provides guidance on how best to attain and track the collection of this data. And lastly, the toolbox includes 4 additional supporting resources. As I mentioned, we provide the 2 case study reports from the City of Windsor and Hamilton, and these really are there to provide inspiration for municipalities as you develop your own cost of doing nothing report. And we've also provided 2 appendices, which include summary tables of national, subnational, and local data sources. Okay, let's do a little bit of a walkthrough to see what's needed to build your own cost of doing nothing report using the municipal template and the data collection tracking tool. The first step is, of course, to read the primer and instructions documents. These will provide you with all of the key background information and instructions needed to create your report. Then, based on your understanding of your own local climate hazards, impacts, and risks, you should start identifying the types of data you will need to collect and who you will need to collaborate with to obtain this data. This understanding can come from any local assessment, as Trevor mentioned. It can be the BARC vulnerability and risk assessment, but it could also be the PIVC assessment, the ISO 31000 risk management framework, or any other local assessment. Our data collection tracking tool provides guidance on both the types of data and the sources. You can use this tool to help identify, track, and collect your local data to be used in your cost of doing nothing report. It's also important to stress that data collection can take time, as Trevor also noted, so make sure you give yourself an adequate runway. As Trevor mentioned as well, you may want to consider setting up a centralized Dropbox or FTP site to help streamline that data collection process. It doesn't need to be too formal and can also expand and formalize over time. Okay, so once you have your data or it's starting to come in, you're now ready to start building your own cost of doing nothing report using the municipal template. The template was really designed with ease of use in mind, with adaptable pre-populated content and guided sections where you can plug in your local data and climate narratives. Parts of the template include an introduction, which describes why understanding costs of inaction matters, and a summary of climate impacts and costs across multiple Canadian jurisdictions. Next are the 8 core impact statement sections. Each of the impact statement sections include pre-populated content on climate hazards, risks, and impacts and costs. And the template finishes with a conclusions and recommendation section, which can be adapted to suit your local context. So what does this look like? Once you've collected your data using the data collection tracking tool, you will start customizing the template to match your locally identified risks. And then using the highlighted sections in the template, input your local data. So I've actually selected a similar risk to the one that that Karina mentioned, which speaks to a point I'll bring up again in a little bit. But in this example here, if your municipality has identified increased risk of flooding and damage to buildings and homes as a local risk, you would use the risk 1 section of the template and input your local costing data. And as Karina, she provided a number of different examples that they used in Windsor. Some other data sources can be major expense records incurred by departments in response to the floods, flood mapping records, which were mentioned, or historic records of calls reporting basement flooding. I also want to note that you should really think about how you should include local stories to augment or supplement local costing data. Once you have collected and inputted all of your local data and climate narratives into all of your locally identified risks, you then need to include any recommendations and considerations for moving forward on adaptation. All right, so you've made your cost of doing nothing report. Now, what should you do with it? There are multiple use cases to consider, which are really anything that's a call to action, that galvanizes support or builds the business case for action. These can include, as both Trevor and Karina mentioned, submitting it as a standalone report to council, or it can go along with an adaptation plan submitted to council. It could also be a backward to new councils, or an update to external or internal stakeholders. With funding, as Karina also mentioned, with funding soon becoming available through the National Adaptation Strategy, the cost of doing nothing report can be a resource to help you with your funding applications. So based on these different ideas, we do have another poll for you, if Eva can help me out with that. Perfect. So of all the purposes for a cost of doing nothing report, which could you see yourself using? So fill out up to 2 if you want.
I think I've launched the wrong poll, Josh.
Yeah, you're right. That is the collecting data poll.
Okay, let me get to the next one here.
I can, let me, oh, go ahead.
Give me one moment, please. Use cases launch. There we are. Sorry about that, Josh.
No worries, no worries. Yeah, so of all the cases, examples we had there, which could you really see yourself using? Which would be the biggest value, or would be a purpose that you see yourself using? I also want to note that if you do happen to have any other examples, so these are the kind of ones that came to mind in building this out. If you have any other, I can see 2 people have selected other. If you want to maybe put them into the chat, or if you want to turn your mic on and tell us what other possible purposes you could think of, that'd be great. Eva, can you see the results, or is it just me again?
Nope, I have 0 people have responded, which I think is incorrect if you are saying that.
Yeah, no, I'm seeing 47 results. I think it's kind of plateaued there.
Do you want to end the poll then, Josh?
Yep, if I end the poll, share results. Can you see that?
I think likely users can. For some reason, it is
Okay, all right.
preventing me from getting data today. Speaking of data challenges.
Well, no worries. Yeah, again, if the two people that selected other also want to include those in the chat, that would be fantastic. But looking at what we have here, it seems like the most common use would be to support funding applications, which is fantastic to hear. And I think that's going to be a really important thing to consider as the national adaptation strategy comes out. Next, we have report to go along with the adaptation plan, which makes sense. And as we saw, it can be very successful in helping pass that with council. And then turned into an infographic, which is cool. I wonder if people would be using that to help share some of the information through social. If you included that, if you could also let us know in the chat section as to why you selected that option and what you would do with that infographic, that would be fantastic. But it's actually a pretty fair spread that all of those use cases seem to be to gel well with how you would use it. So I'm going to stop sharing that now. And
perfect. Thank you so much, Josh. What I'm going to do is go ahead and put the link to the toolbox into the chat, so people can go ahead and see that on their machines. And I just wanted to go back in because there was a few more questions that crept into the chat as we were moving forward. So Josh, I don't know if you want to stop screen sharing there and we'll just go into...
Oh, yeah, I just had one more thing I just want to mention, sort of summing it up, but we can do that after the questions if you want, or...
Sure. No, you can go ahead and do that now. That's fine.
Okay. Yeah, just based on the research that we went through and our experience working with the different with Trevor and Karina, we just wanted to share a number of considerations and recommendations for moving forward. As mentioned, the data collection process really is going to be inherently a collaborative process with a number of actors. So it'll be really important to identify early on which departments and staff, Indigenous knowledge keepers, and external stakeholders will be involved, and to identify those communications and establish those communication pathways and relationship management processes as early as possible. As mentioned a number of times, it can take time to start collecting this data. So make sure you give yourself that runway so that you have enough time to collect, analyze, and report. You may want to consider giving around 4 to 6 weeks to collect the data. But as we heard with Trevor in Hamilton, you can also start to focus on the available climate narratives that you already have and make recommendations for continued data collection moving forward. In considering the data collection process and management, as we saw with Karina, prioritize the collection of data based on feasibility. It's fine to start with a little bit of data, knowing that in time, the breadth of data sources can expand over time. And lastly, building on this, it's in order to address the threats of climate change to our communities at the pace required, it's really important to focus, and we kind of talk about this a lot, that it's really important, and we encourage you to prioritize progress over perfection. That adaptation will reduce risks even in the face of uncertainty. So let progress really be your North Star. Those are our sort of high-level 4 key points that we want to leave you with today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Josh. And hopefully as folks are starting to peruse the toolbox online, more questions are coming in. But that was a great way to end with how we hope the toolbox can be used, and a little bit of our guidance around that. As I did mention, a few thoughts and questions have come in through the chat, so I'm happy to continue reading those. Please feel free to use the chat for questions or to raise your hand, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. And if not, of course, please feel free to reach out to us, and we will direct those questions to either Josh, myself, Trevor, or Karina following the webinar. So a comment that came in with the data collection poll, that the challenges would depend on what type of data was being collected. Data on gains and losses to ecological services would be very difficult, but stormwater modeling may be easier. So I think that's a really good point, that data collection isn't a black and white, easy or hard piece. And your comment there really speaks to focusing on what is feasible while not stopping trying to collect more challenging data, but really focusing on progress, as Josh outlined in his last slide. There was another question to you, Karina, if you wouldn't mind, on how you determined low and high emission scenarios. Which website do you use to say, for example, did you follow the information from the Climate Atlas or climatedata.ca?
Good question. I used an assortment of tools, some of our own local downscaled models, climatedata.ca, and Climate Atlas. It really depended. I looked at our historical weather from Environment Canada, and I tried to match it as closely with the baseline provided by those groups. So that's kind of how I picked and choose. There was some difference. Some of the information comes from, for our instance, some of it comes from Detroit, some of it comes from Windsor. So there is some variability. But that's what I try to do, is look at our historical and match that up, then assume that the projections would be more accurate on that.
Thanks so much, Karina. Josh, I think this is one for you to handle. There's a comment that sea level rise wasn't listed among the national impact statements, the 8 that were chosen. Was this just missed by the reader, or obviously they suggest that sea level rise is less significant in the short term and only applies to coastal communities, but surely a huge impact. Any thoughts, Josh, you'd like to share on perhaps some of those omissions from the toolbox?
Yeah. So we in the primer we speak to sort of notable omissions, and we do have in the primer we speak to both sea level rise, like slow onset climate change impacts like sea level rise, as well as wildfires. In the selection of these 8 national impact statements, we focused on ones that were going to be the most ubiquitous across the country, across jurisdictions. And we the template itself is designed in such a way that it can be expanded, it can be adapted. The framework within it can be used and is really intended for municipalities to map use their own vulnerability and risk assessments to determine what it is that is going to end up in their costing reports. So the 8 there, we could have had 100. We had to we wanted to choose ones that were going to be the most representative, as well as the frequency with which they appeared in the local the adaptation plans that we work with, and the availability of quality data on climate impacts as well as costs. So it's important that we had that data all available, and something that would be most universally applicable for the municipalities as they use the tools.
Thanks, Josh, for that response to the question. Another question came in, and I'll just read it off. The intro said how important it is to weave in Indigenous systems of knowledge, but I didn't hear any reference to this in the presentations. Could someone discuss what type of Indigenous knowledge is being referred to, and how embracing it would be possible in the types of exercises discussed in the presentations? Is part of the toolbox dedicated to this topic. Maybe I'll start, and Josh, I'll throw to you if there's anything you'd like to add in terms of the toolbox. Yes, we have dedicated about 5 to 7 pages on Indigenous knowledge systems in the toolbox. However, there was absolutely no way that we could be prescriptive in how to do that. It is a relationship-based effort, and so we've spoken in the toolbox about how these 2 ways of knowing can be woven together, and some considerations on possible effects and possible climate impacts that Indigenous peoples are more exposed to, but really wanted to include this as there was a real knowledge gap in the available literature, peer-reviewed and broad literature, on assessing the impacts and costs of climate change that didn't lean heavily on Western knowledge. So we wanted to include this as to open up that conversation, but not to presuppose that we could have all the answers about how this is done. So there is a section within those, I think it's 7 pages, apologies, which offer considerations for local governments on how to approach this and how to weave the data that they might have within a broader knowledge system. But it's certainly not a checklist. It's just meant to offer some considerations in moving this forward, realizing that that is a trust building process that takes a longer amount of time than one might have in putting together this sort of report. I don't know if others have something to add on that piece.
Well, maybe
I
just-
think mutes, but Trevor,
Go
I'll
ahead.
go to you first and then Josh.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's definitely an ongoing consideration in Hamilton's climate impact adaptation plan. We want to set up and support Indigenous knowledge keepers, or a circle of Indigenous knowledge keepers, not just for specific actions, but for the entire plan as part of our ongoing implementation and monitoring program. And ensuring the traditional ecological knowledge is interwoven and included in that ongoing monitoring is a priority in the adaptation plan. And I know it's going to take a lot of time. And speaking of time too, I wanted to maybe highlight too on the timelines, because we weren't able to include really any indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge on the cost of doing nothing data collection, for example. And I think really depends on the size of the municipality and how complex your data collection process is, but I would probably estimate like maybe 6 to 8 months timeline, just in terms of getting that methodology, doing the consultation and beginning that data collection, which I'm sure, depending on staff capacity, will trickle in some slower than others. So I just wanted to highlight that timeline too. Is definitely give yourself lots of time to do the consultation, to set up the methodology and be able to collect the data.
Josh, did you have something to add to that?
I think you both have covered it. Just that that with this resource, it really is important that it's a process, and that the framework used to assess the impacts to Indigenous people, it needs to be a process done by Indigenous people and with Indigenous people working together in collaboration. So that's really what we speak to in our guidance around that. So take a look. There's also a number of Indigenous resources that also will support municipalities in doing this as well, which is not by any means exhaustive list either. We started with what would be a good starting place.
Yes, balancing the need for additional resources and that feeling of overwhelmedness when one opens a document that is too lengthy and too prescriptive. I did also want to mention that some of you may have seen last week, I believe it was last week, we also launched our resource for equitable climate adaptation, which speaks to a lot of the considerations that Trevor raised. So I'll ask one of my ICLEI colleagues who may be on the line to post that link also in the chat for those who might be interested. The next comment actually triggers a very important thought, which was a comment that it is a pity that there is no reference to Quebec's subnational databases in Appendix A. There's a lot of information available for Quebec municipalities. I do agree, it is a pity. As was mentioned, our funding for this came from the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Parks under the Canada-Ontario Agreement respecting the Great Lakes. And so our staff on this was unfortunately predominantly English speaking. That being said, we have been able to secure funding to translate the products that Josh had spoken about, and that translation will be available in December, so next month. It's gone and is currently being translated. I think we can take a look within that translation at any opportunity to link to the databases that you reference, and so we might reach out to you actually for assistance in tracking those down. But I do agree it would have been more comprehensive to be able to do fulsome work bilingually in putting this together. So I do acknowledge that. A question for Trevor and Karina here. Did either municipality collaborate or work with surrounding neighboring municipalities in any capacity? If so, can you please speak to challenges and opportunities?
Sure, I'll start with that one. So in Windsor, both the town of Tecumseh and town of LaSalle, as well as the county of Essex, were invited to our, I guess, our community task force meetings. So they were actually involved in the determination, risk, and vulnerability of our impacts. And particularly our conservation authority was heavily involved in some of the data collection for some of our flood risk mapping and modeling. So they were involved there. The one thing that I do find challenging, and it is still a problem to be resolved, and I actually am taking a presentation to our regional CIOs on this, is that, you know, each municipality is kind of trying to do like a hard stop at political boundaries for some of this adaptation work. And, you know, we have numerous studies that say, okay, here's our projections, or we've mapped it, but then there's that line, right, down in LaSalle, town of Tecumseh, and that's definitely a challenge. We need to be able to work collaboratively across them because, you know, issues on Lake Erie are going to affect Windsor and Tecumseh, and so we need to have those conversations better than we are, but they have been involved along the path. We're just looking at how do we make that better now.
And maybe I'll just add, it's very similar to Karina. We consulted. In Hamilton we have 4 different conservation authorities in Hamilton's political jurisdiction. So just in that in itself was pretty complicated. I think there's needs to be ongoing too, because varying conservation authorities have varying, for example, like floodplain mapping accuracy, spatial scale as well. So that's part of our lessons learned, and something that we want to work with them moving forward, depending and with the uncertainty of conservation authorities in Ontario moving forward and the capacity. But also I just wanted to highlight, not necessarily through this process, but we have been working with our adjacent municipality, the City of Burlington, on what's called the Bay Area Climate Change Council. And so that's a community-based organization of citizens, organizations, and different institutions across both Hamilton and Burlington. And that's really the structure that we've created to help to look at synergies, linkages, not just with climate adaptation, but as well as climate mitigation actions, and how we move forward collectively to pool resources, for example, pool expert knowledge and whatnot. So yeah, I just wanted to mention the Bay Area Climate Change Council, which I'm proud of. That was probably a 3-year work plan to set that up, and I'm happy to share any additional information or resources that now they have their own supporting staff to support that council as well.
Thank you, Trevor and Karina. Pat, I just realized I skipped your question, so I'll jump to it in 1 second. But I think the question that was just asked really relates to it, this last one around opportunities and challenges of working locally. So if you don't mind, I'll jump to that one for a second, which is, what challenges do you see in the application of this tool for small communities of less than 25,000, which in Ontario is almost 48% of the municipalities? I think the challenge will 100% be staff capacity to take this on whilst doing other work. without likely an enhanced budget to do that. We have designed this toolbox to be as usable as possible. That template is a Word doc that opens up and you can delete, move, add text. That's not to say that will answer all of the challenges related to staff capacity, but I think the comment about working regionally that Trevor and Karina were just answering is really an opportunity there to address that staff capacity challenge. Neighboring municipalities needn't create their own cost of doing nothing report. People, goods, natural assets flow between those political boundaries. And so neighboring communities could come together to bring their data together, pull their data together, and work on a cost of doing nothing report or a business case report together. It's not to say it would alleviate all the concerns, but I think it is an opportunity and one that we should think about more often, whether all the individual smaller municipalities need to do all this work on their own, or whether can they pool their resources to produce something. So I just wanted to add that, but I do acknowledge that resource constraints exist for all municipalities, but perhaps are more highlighted in smaller ones where people are serving double duty, and obviously staff workforces are far smaller. We have designed this though with that in mind. Pat, I will go back to the question you asked. Did either Hamilton or Windsor try to estimate the cost of shoreline erosion due to increased storm activity and higher Great Lakes water levels? I assume much of both cities have hardened shorelines that will need ongoing maintenance or replacement.
Trevor, do you want to go first, or?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. It's a little, I'm sure mine is a little bit shorter than yours, Karina, too. So long story short is no, not for this process. Again, we were probably given less than like 6 months to try to collect all of this data. But in Hamilton, as many of you may know, we have both. We have the Niagara Escarpment as well as the shoreline, which in recent years have been heavily impacted by the impacts of climate change through increased wind and precipitation events. And so we were able to apply through the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund specifically for shoreline restoration activities. But what is also included in our adaptation plan is a very large study to look at and assess the vulnerabilities of the escarpment throughout Hamilton to better understand the vulnerability and risk of that particular piece of Hamilton, and to better understand the cost implications of that.
Karina?
Yeah, so we, like you suggested, Pat, we do have mostly hard shoreline in the city of Windsor, with the exception of our Peche Island, our natural heritage island. It did see significant erosion during the high lake levels in 2020 and 2021. And basically there we did emergency repairs and protection for that shoreline. So that number was pretty easy. We just knew exactly how much the cost to protect that island was, and it's in there. We did not put a value on, I guess, the loss of the land in that island, but there was not a costing put on it, but an added benefit for improving fish habitat and stuff. So that really wasn't the cost of doing nothing, but that was kind of the selling point to make the protection just a little bit better. And like Trevor, we are also undertaking more studies on our west side of the city, where we also started noting problems with the high lake levels. So in our next round, hopefully in 2023, I will be refining a lot of these impacts and adding the other costs that we've addressed or seen since we did these ones.
Thank you. Looks like there's one more question in the chat, which is just wondering what your general approach is to account for closed public amenities. In one of the slides in Karina's presentation, the social costs of amenities being closed, soccer fields, etc., I believe were quantified. Would you mind sharing what general approach you took to quantify this? Would this be through the public health lens? Thank you.
So in my case, the analysis for both the, we have sports fields and we also have the ice rink. It was really the economic loss to the city, but we noted the loss of the social aspect. One of the things too that we noted that I cannot put a value on, particularly with our ice rink, is the loss of culture. You know, we're in the City of Windsor, we're in Canada, and you know, we might not be able to skate outdoors. So that was kind of there. Again, we didn't put a price on it. But we have in other impacts where we've looked at mortality rates, we've put costs on that. I think I had to look it up. Canadian government has, it's called the value of statistical life. So if you're looking at increased mortality, the Canadian government has actually put a value on a life. So that's one of the things that we looked at for increasing health burdens through several of our impacts as well. But it would be nice to find some kind of study to say, okay, what is the social value of losing out on, you know, soccer or something like that?
And just at a very high level approach and thought is, we also didn't look at those either social or cost implications relating to recreation or sports fields currently right now. As I mentioned, a big part of the adaptation plan is to begin setting those kind of processes or methodologies. And I think this is one in my public health background, the folks in chronic disease prevention would be especially interested in helping. And that's the type of, I think, multidisciplinary and multi-departmental approach that needs to happen through this ongoing work and ongoing process, so you can get those multiple lenses. And I think it's just a matter of, and what we tried to do in Hamilton in the most recent report to council is not trying to quantify everything, but just simply stating that there is this implication and this either benefit of accelerated climate action or potential damage that would be caused through this event. So I don't think everything needs to be quantified, in my personal opinion, but just by stating that, and I think many councillors, city councillors, are more inclined to have that high level or that storytelling rather than hard and fast quantifiable numbers. Telling a story and that culture example, Karina, that you mentioned, I think is extremely impactful. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
And I just want to reiterate, oh, so Josh, I think you're about to say the same thing I am, hopefully, which is to reiterate the point, Josh, you were making earlier around the template, including space to put those stories, those local, perhaps non-quantifiable stories of what climate has cost the community in terms of loss of a social or a cultural asset, whether that's park ice rinks that weren't able to be run, or lost camp days and things like that because of extreme heat. Josh?
Yeah, in the primer as well, and in the introduction to the municipal template, we describe a way to reframe the idea of what costs mean, for away from necessarily just data, like the hard data or financial data specifically, looking at both the ecological and social costs. And also, this is especially important to when thinking about weaving through Indigenous knowledge systems as well. So it's something that we speak to in the primer, and hopefully that will provide the guidance necessary.
Thanks, Josh. I'm not seeing additional questions. So what I would love to do is, of course, thank you both, Karina and Trevor, for presenting today, but also Karina for letting us the real R&D, rip off and duplicate your hard work in creating this toolbox, and Trevor for allowing us to use Hamilton as a test case to see what it would be like and what real world challenges kind of can appear when trying to collect this data and what can be done to overcome those. We've put in the chat the link to the toolbox. We ask as you use it to reach out. Let us know if you have questions. Also, let us know what you're able to pull together. Any interesting insights, we'd love to know those and to integrate that into future iterations. We're putting the link to the toolbox again into the chat. And I encourage you to download the resources and try using them. We really have tried to make them as usable as possible for people who are busy with other work, and to do this alongside that work to help take that work further and be able to lead to more implementation, as that's ultimately where we need to get to. So with that, I thank Karina, Trevor, Josh, and of course all of you for attending today's session. The recording will be posted to our website, as well as PDFs of the presentation shared. We will share with the registrants to this webinar. Thank you so much and have a great day.